In this lesson, we're going to take a step back from the code, the predictions web service we've been looking at recently, in order to get some perspective on web services. In particular, I'd like to look at the two dominant flavors of web service out there right now. They both go by names, REST in the one case, SOAP in the other. Later on, we'll worry about exactly how the two are related. So this is our first look at these terms. As you can see, I've got a working file up on the screen in Emacs. It's called restsoap.txt. It summarizes some important points. I'm not going to follow it in order. Instead, I'm going to focus on the part in the middle. First, though, let me say a few words about the acronyms. REST was coined by Roy Fielding in a PhD dissertation in 2000. It stands for Representational State Transfer, but it's come to have a completely independent meaning, I would say, nowadays, and Fielding is not altogether happy about that. But you know how these things happen in our field. The Rails framework has been extremely influential in determining how the term REST is now understood, and I'll refer to that point any number of times. The predictions web service that we looked at the last couple of lessons would be considered to be REST style. SOAP is quite different. SOAP is actually two things. It's a messaging protocol. It's typically built atop HTTP, but in principle, it could be built atop anything else. It's also an XML dialect. So, for example, a SOAP document is XML, but it has its own distinct grammar and it has its own vocabulary. SOAP originally stood for Simple Object Access Protocol, but nowadays, officially, it doesn't stand for anything. So when I use the terms, I typically say REST-style web services or RESTful web services in order to underscore the informality of REST. SOAP-based web services, by contrast, follow the SOAP protocol and use the SOAP dialect of XML. Now let's look at the difference from a programmer's point of view, since that's the thing that interests us the most. So you can see I've got the cursor placed just to the left of REST, and I want to look at the conversation between the client and the service. So REST is very close to the HTTP metal. A client makes a request against a RESTful web service by sending one of the standard HTTP requests, a GET request, a POST request, a PUT request, a delete request, perhaps some other type of request as well. But the four you see there on the screen would be the dominant ones. The service, in turn, responds with an XML or a JSON or perhaps a plain text or perhaps even some other type of document. In principle, the service might respond with a binary payload, but this would be unusual, and I'd argue that web services are not ideally suited for that sort of payload. They can be used that way, but that's not really what they're best at. Now let's contrast that with SOAP. In a SOAP conversation, the client is going to send an HTTP POST request. Let me just allude to the reason now and get into more detail later. A POST request has a body. A GET request, for example, does not have a body. And in a SOAP conversation, a request is always a SOAP document. The response is also a SOAP document. So SOAP requests are POST requests, and embedded in the body of that HTTP request is a SOAP document. So it basically says, this is what the client would like. The service responds in turn, typically with a SOAP document. There has been some movement in SOAP so that now JSON is also supported, mostly in the .NET world, but to some extent in the Java world. It's also supported for response documents. Between the two, SOAP predates REST, and at one time it looked as if SOAP was going to be the dominant player. Rails, in its initial release, for example, had some limited support for SOAP, but quickly moved off of that to REST. Right now, it's fair to say, I think, that REST is the dominant approach to web services. All of the social networking websites, Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, Basically, anything you can think of, they all support REST-style services and typically only REST-style services. Among the big commercial players, Amazon is the one that consistently provides both REST-style and SOAP-based services.